fear, hunger, spirituality, wealth, power. So often the study of the Atlantic slave trade in U.S. classrooms focuses on the effect in the Americas. We learn about Nat Turner, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and Harriet Tubman. We learn about the experiences of the enslaved in America. Rarely, however, does curriculum focus on the impacts that trade had in West Africa. We're here to change this educational pattern by making a few key points. Experiences of West Africans were directly dependent on where they lived, in a slaving society or in a society that was enslaved.
For people who were in areas that were victimized by slave traders, the most immediate impact is physical insecurity, fear that at any moment parties of raiders or a hostile army could come in and overpower you and overpower your society and take you or your loved ones away. If you lived in a society that for the most part was a slaving society, for instance, one of the big centralized states that often preyed on other populations to produce slaves, you might not see those effects in your day-to-day life. What you would see is the availability of imported goods that came in through the slave trade.
It is impossible to say what West Africa would look like today in the absence of the Atlantic slave trade. It began in the early 1500s and reached its peak in the 1700s.
What we do have evidence for is the emergence of large, powerful, centralized states in the 19th century that were connected with the slave trade. A good example is Asante in present-day Ghana.
Large states like the Asante Empire were already beginning to form before the slave trade peaked in the 1700s. In the late 1600s, the Asante Empire was a group of city-states that traded and fought with one another. One city-state became stronger and began to conquer others until they reached the city-states further to the north. By the time the Asante people encountered the Europeans in the mid-18th century, their empire encompassed most of the territory within the borders of modern Ghana. There were rich deposits of gold in the empire. The Asante traded this gold with the Europeans for weapons and other goods, and in turn, used these weapons to continue expanding.
As they expanded by conquering other areas and other city-states, they took prisoners and they sold many of those prisoners to Europeans at the coast, gradually changing the nature of trade with Europeans from one based on gold to one based on slaves. In places where more men than women were taken, there would be demographic imbalances that were left in the wake of slave raids, which often contributed to more polygamy, for instance. If men were taken out, there are more women in the population.
The more slave trading went on, the more equipped the Asante were to expand militarily, which in turn allowed them to continue to take captives and funnel them into the trade. The Asante used these proceeds to fund their state, obtain military equipment, pay the army, and keep the people they subordinated loyal through distribution of goods. So here is the key divide. For the people protected by the Asante Empire, life in many ways improved with the slave trade. They had more access to goods and lived a life protected from other empires. On the other hand, people in societies that were enslaved lived in constant fear of raiding parties coming to take them or their beloved away. Individuals in societies that were enslaved could rarely make plans for the future. They couldn't worry about whether to build fortifications for defense or more effective infrastructure in their towns when they were worried about being captured. Africa is a continent of great linguistic variety. When individuals moved, either by force or of their own volition, they inevitably encountered other people and different languages. These languages adapted and developed as people interacted, similar to the development of Spanglish in parts of the United States with high concentration of Spanish-speaking people. Religion in West Africa changed in 3 different ways during the Atlantic slave trade.
The first has to do with indigenous religions, which tended to be localized in the sense that they were connected to worship of spirits that were in the natural world in a particular place, and they were connected to ancestors who had lived and died and been buried in a particular place. And so when people were mobile in the era of the slave trade, they often had to leave behind spiritual practices associated with the place that they had left behind.
When they arrived at their next destination, they had to adapt their spiritual practices to what they perceived the religious landscape of their new home to be. Islam had migrated from North Africa into sub-Saharan West Africa with traders starting in the 8th or 9th century AD. Consequently, many of the people shipped to the Americas during the Atlantic slave trade were Muslim. Since Islamic law forbids enslavement of fellow Muslims, small pockets of people came together for mutual protection, which gave rise to Muslim states within West Africa.
Which began as defensive organizations, and because it was so hard to defend oneself without the means of defense that could be obtained through trade, many of them got involved in slave trading.
Christianity was imposed on West Africans through missionaries. For instance, in the Congo Kingdom in modern-day Angola, the Portuguese sent missionaries who made connections with local nobility. These noblemen dedicated the court to Christianity and made Christianity the official religion. The Portuguese didn't just come as missionaries, however. They took slaves too. And when they did, they frequently branded their captives with crosses to signal their conversion, as a literal baptism by fire. Early in the 1800s, sentiments changed among Christian missionaries in West Africa. Whereas earlier Christians helped support the slave trade, missionaries in the 1800s began to develop abolitionist tendencies and focused on converting and educating people who had been caught up in the slave trade. In the 1800s, the British decided they no longer wanted to be a part of the process of enslaving West Africans. Instead, they decided that they were going to actively deploy their navy to intercept slave vessels. Samuel Ajayi Crowther was a captive on a ship that was intercepted by the British on its way to the Americas. After returning to West Africa and converting to Christianity, he became an Anglican missionary. Eventually, he became the first black bishop of the Anglican Church. Here's an excerpt from one of his letters recounting his experiences as a captive and as a free man. The morning in which my town of Sogun shared the same fate which many others had experienced was fair and delightful, and many of the inhabitants were engaged in their respective occupations. Here, a most sorrowful scene imaginable was to be witnessed. Women, some with 3, 4, or 6 children clinging to their arms with the infants on their backs and such baggage as they could carry on their heads, running as fast as they could through prickly shrubs which, hooking their blighs and other loads, drew them down from the heads of their bearers. Your humble servant was thus called, with his mother, 2 sisters, one an infant about 10 months old, and a cousin, while endeavoring to escape in the manner above described. My load consisted in nothing else than my bow and 5 arrows in the quiver. The bow I had lost in the shrub while I was extricating myself, before I could think of making any use of it against my enemies. The last view I had of my father was when he came from the fight to give us a signal to flee. He entered into our house, which was burnt some time back for some offense given by my father's adopted son. Hence, I never saw him more. Here I must take thy leave, unhappy, comfortless father. I learned some time afterward that he was killed in another battle.
I don't want to say that everything in modern Africa can be traced back to the slave trade, but there is a recurring pattern that exists now, existed in the colonial period, and existed in the era of the slave trade, and I don't think that's a coincidence. And the pattern is of African leaders looking to outside trading partners as a way of bringing in the resources that enable them to maintain their political power at home.
2 prime examples of African leaders who kept close ties with outside trading partners are Mobutu Sese Seko and Sani Abacha. Seko was the longtime president and dictator of Zaire, which is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. He had close relationships with the United States, China, France, Belgium, and the Soviet Union. He was known for corruption, embezzlement, and violating the human rights of many of his citizens. Sani Abacha was a Nigerian army general and politician who served as the de facto president of Nigeria from 1993 to 1998. Abacha was also accused of human rights violations for the hanging of a popular political activist who spoke out against him. Abacha was also considered a corrupt leader for embezzlement and his suspicious relationships with Shell Oil.
So as you can see, there is much more to the Atlantic slave trade than the ways it affected people in the Americas. The experiences of those involved in the slave trade varied tremendously. Some lives were improved while others were crushed and broken. It changed power dynamics and led to the formation of large militarized states. It altered the way people practice religion. There's so much more information on how the Atlantic slave trade affected West Africa that we weren't able to include in our video. But we encourage you to continue researching on your own so you can learn more about this topic and other less discussed parts of history. Stay curious.